He had 10 number 1 singles. Okay? He was the king of a new kind of music. His movies made millions. And then on March 24th, 1958, Elvis Presley became U.S. Army Private 53,310,761. The world's biggest star traded his gold lame suit for army greens. The official story is simple. He did his duty. He served his country. He came home 2 years later a better man. But the reality is a lot messier. Those 2 years in the army, mostly spent in Friedberg, Germany, weren't just a pause. They were a crucible. They changed him completely. The boy who went in never really came out. What was left was a different person, one haunted by new ghosts and saddled with new addictions. The time he spent as a soldier is filled with black holes, strange stories, and questions that have never been fully answered. We think we know the story of Elvis, but the army years are a locked room in the middle of his life. And inside that room are the clues to his entire future and his eventual tragic end. Did the army save him from the pressures of fame, or did it hand him the very tools of his own destruction? What really happened in Germany? Number 18, why did he choose Frank Sinatra for his comeback? It was May 12th, 1960. Elvis was back. He hadn't performed for a live audience in years. The world was watching. The vehicle for his return was a television special. It was called Welcome Home, Elvis. But the host wasn't a rock and roll peer. It wasn't Jerry Lee Lewis or Little Richard. It was Frank Sinatra. The choice was jarring. Sinatra was the establishment. He was the crooner his fans' parents listened to. Just a few years earlier, in 1957, Sinatra had publicly condemned rock and roll. He called it the most brutal, ugly, degenerate, vicious form of expression he had ever heard. He said it was sung by cretinous goons and was a rancid-smelling aphrodisiac. And now, he was welcoming the king of that very music back into the fold. The entire special felt like a coronation, but in the wrong kingdom. The man behind this decision was Colonel Tom Parker. Parker's strategy was always about money and longevity. He saw the army years as a pivot point. The rebellious rocker was a young man's game. To have a career like Sinatra or Bing Crosby, Elvis needed to appeal to a wider, more adult audience. He needed to become a family entertainer. The Sinatra special was the first step in that transformation. The numbers were huge. ABC paid a staggering $125,000 for the one-off appearance, an almost unbelievable sum for television in 1960. The show, officially titled The Frank Sinatra Timex Special Welcome Home, Elvis, captured a 41.5% share of the television audience. It was a massive success by any commercial metric, but something was lost. Elvis looked different. He was leaner, more chiseled, but also stiffer. He performed his old hits like Hound Dog, but the fire was gone. The dangerous energy was replaced by a polished professional sheen. He sang duets with Sinatra, trading lines on Witchcraft and Love Me Tender. It was a symbolic passing of a torch, or perhaps a taming of a wild animal. Elvis seemed deferential, almost nervous, in the presence of the older star. He was no longer the defiant kid from Memphis. He was a clean-cut veteran, respectable and safe. The music journalist Peter Guralnick, in his definitive biography Careless Love, the Unmaking of Elvis Presley, details how this was a calculated move by Parker to reposition Elvis for the lucrative Las Vegas and Hollywood markets. The goal was to smooth off the rough edges that had made him a star in the first place. The Sinatra special was the public unveiling of this new, neutered Elvis. He was no longer a threat to the establishment. He was now a part of it. The very man who had called him a cretin was now smiling beside him collecting a check. It was a brilliant business move. But it was also the beginning of the end for the Elvis that had changed the world. He spent the next decade making a string of forgettable movies, singing songs that were a pale imitation of his former glory. The rebellion had been quashed, not by the army, but by the man who was supposed to be his manager. The Sinatra special wasn't a welcome home party. It was a funeral for the king of rock and roll, and the birth of a family-friendly brand. So, what puzzles remain from that night? Was Elvis aware that he was being repackaged, or did he genuinely admire Sinatra and see this as an honor? Did Sinatra's opinion of rock and roll actually change, or was he just a shrewd entertainer who recognized a massive payday? And The most important question, if Elvis had refused to do the special and had instead returned with a raw rock and roll tour, could he have avoided the creative stagnation of the 1960s and changed the course of his own life? Number 17. Was the famous haircut a surrender? On March 24th, 1958, Elvis Presley was inducted into the U.S. Army at the Kennedy Veterans Hospital in Memphis. A few days later, at Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, the world saw something it thought it would never see. A barber named James Peterson took a pair of electric clippers to the most famous hair in the world. The jet black pompadour, the symbol of youthful rebellion, the hair that girls screamed for, fell to the floor in clumps. The event was a media circus. Dozens of reporters and photographers were there to document the shearing. The Army called it the haircut heard round the world. Ostensibly, this was about one thing: equality. The Army wanted to show that no one, not even Elvis Presley, was above the rules. He was just another GI getting a standard issue haircut. Elvis played his part perfectly. He smiled for the cameras, he joked with the barber, he said, "Hair today, gone tomorrow." It was a masterclass in public relations. It presented Elvis as a humble, patriotic young man, willing to sacrifice his identity for his country. Colonel Parker made sure the moment was captured from every angle. It was proof that his boy was a good American. But under the surface, something else was happening. The hair wasn't just hair. For Elvis, it was everything. It was a key part of his identity. He was obsessed with it. He dyed it jet black, a color it wasn't natural. He spent hours styling it. The pompadour and the long sideburns were a deliberate statement. They were a rejection of the crew-cut conformity of the 1950s. They were a visual representation of the wild, untamed energy of his music. Losing his hair was like a lion losing its mane. It was a symbolic castration. In his book, Elvis and Gladys, author Elaine Dundee argues that the haircut was a deeply traumatic event for Elvis, one that mirrored the loss of control he was feeling in his life. He was being stripped of his power, piece by piece. First his freedom, now his most recognizable feature. The photos from that day are telling. Behind the forced smile, there's a look of bewilderment in his eyes. He looks like a boy, not a king. He's trying to be a good sport, but he seems to understand that a fundamental part of him is being taken away. The military has always used the haircut as a tool for breaking down individuality and enforcing conformity. It's the first step in remaking a civilian into a soldier. You strip away their old identity to build a new one based on discipline and obedience to the group. For Elvis, a man whose entire career was built on being a unique individual, this process was especially brutal. He wasn't just losing hair, he was losing a piece of Elvis Presley, the persona he had so carefully constructed. The world saw a GI getting a haircut, but what might have really been happening was a ritualistic surrender, a public taming of the rebel. The rock and roll outlaw was being remade into a soldier, a number, a cog in a machine. And he had to sit there and smile while it happened. The questions that linger are haunting. Did Elvis truly understand the symbolic power of that moment? Or was he just following orders, trying to get through the day? How much of his subsequent willingness to conform, to make the safe movies and sing the bland songs, was born in that barber's chair? And the most chilling question of all, when he saw his reflection with that short military haircut, did he see a soldier, or did he see a stranger who had stolen the king's crown? Number 16, did he really get no special treatment? The official line from the U.S. Army was firm and clear. Private Presley would be treated just like any other soldier. There would be no special privileges. He would pull KP duty, go on long marches, and sleep in the barracks with the rest of the men. This was a crucial part of the narrative. It was designed to show the American public that the draft was fair, and that even the biggest celebrity was not above serving his country. For the most part, especially during basic training at Fort Hood, Texas, this seemed to be true. Fellow soldiers from that time, like Rex Mansfield, who wrote the book Elvis in the Army, confirmed that Elvis did his fair share of the dirty work. He was determined to prove he wasn't a Hollywood soldier. But when Elvis was transferred to the 3rd Armored Division in Friedberg, West Germany, the story began to change. The rules started to bend. While other soldiers lived in the cramped institutional barracks on the base, Elvis was granted permission to live off base. This was a privilege almost unheard of for a soldier of his rank. He, along with his father Vernon, his grandmother Minnie May, and 2 friends and bodyguards, Red West and Lamar Feike, rented a large, comfortable house at 14 Goestrasse in the nearby town of Bad Nauheim. This arrangement completely changed the dynamic of his army experience. He was a soldier by day, but he was Elvis Presley by night. He would leave his home in a chauffeur-driven BMW and report for duty. After his work as a scout jeep driver for the 32nd Tank Battalion was done, he would return to his private kingdom. The house became a magnet for friends, hangers-on, and young German women. It was the site of all-night parties, karate practice sessions, and private jam sessions. He wasn't living the life of a typical GI in a foreign country. He was living a strange hybrid life caught between two worlds. The army brass tolerated this, likely because the PR value of having Elvis in uniform was immense. As documented in Peter Guralnick's Careless Love, the army often used Elvis for photo opportunities and to boost morale. He was a walking, talking recruitment poster. Allowing him to live off base was a small price to pay for the positive publicity. It also kept the chaos of his celebrity life contained and away from the main base, preventing disruptions. However, this special treatment had a dark side. The house on Goethstrasse became an isolated bubble. It was there, away from the structured discipline of the base, that some of his most destructive habits began to take hold. He was surrounded by his own people, who catered to his every whim. It was in that house that his use of amphetamines, which he was allegedly introduced to during late-night maneuvers, became a regular habit to stay awake for his nighttime social life. It was also where he began to rely on sleeping pills to come down from the uppers. The lack of normal military oversight created a private space where his dependencies could grow, unchecked by the discipline that was supposed to be the hallmark of army life. The special treatment, meant to accommodate his fame, ended up creating the perfect incubator for his future addictions. So the puzzle is not as simple as whether he got special treatment. He clearly did. The real questions are about the consequences. Did the Army's decision to let him live off base directly contribute to his lifelong battle with prescription drugs? Was the isolation of that house in Bad Nauheim more damaging to his psyche than living in the barracks would have been? And if the Army had stuck to its promise of NOO, special treatment, forcing him to live the true life of a soldier 24/7, could it have saved him from himself? Number 15, what really happened to his voice in Germany. Before he went into the Army, Elvis's voice was a raw force of nature. It was wild, energetic, and full of the rebellious spirit of rock and roll. Think of the hiccuping, frantic energy of Hound Dog or the primal growl of Jailhouse Rock. It was the sound of youth itself. When he came out of the Army 2 years later, his voice had changed. It was still a magnificent instrument, but it was different. It was deeper, richer, and more controlled. The raw edge was gone, replaced by a smooth, polished baritone. The change was so significant that it marked a clear dividing line in his career. The question is, why? The official story is that he simply matured. He was a young man who grew up. His voice settled and deepened naturally. There is certainly some truth to this. He was 23 when he was drafted and 25 when he was discharged. A man's voice can certainly change in that time. But that's too simple an explanation for such a dramatic shift in style and tone. Something else happened during his time in Germany. A key piece of the puzzle lies in a series of private recordings Elvis made while living at his house on Goethestrasse in Bad Nauheim. These are often referred to as the Frankfurt Sessions or the Bad Nauheim tapes. These weren't professional studio recordings. They were casual, informal sessions recorded on a basic home tape recorder. On these tapes, Elvis wasn't singing rock and roll. He was singing gospel hymns, pop ballads, and even opera arias like O Sol Mio. He was experimenting with his voice, pushing its range and exploring its textures. He was listening to artists like Mario Lanza, the famous operatic tenor, and trying to emulate his powerful, dramatic style. These tapes reveal a man who was actively retraining his own voice. Away from the pressures of the recording studio and the expectations of his fans, he was woodshedding. He was teaching himself to be a different kind of singer. Charlie Hodge, a friend and fellow soldier who was with him in Germany, often played guitar and sang harmony during these sessions. He later recalled how seriously Elvis took this vocal exploration. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a dedicated practice. Elvis was consciously transforming himself from a rock and roll shouter into a technical vocalist. This was partly driven by the music he was being sent by his record label, RCA. The songs were becoming more sophisticated with sweeping orchestrations and complex melodies. Songs like It's Now or Never, which was based on a Sol Mio, required a different vocal approach than Blue Suede Shoes. But Elvis wasn't just responding to the material, he was driving the change himself. He wanted to prove that he was more than just a rocker. He wanted to be seen as a great singer in the same league as the crooners he admired, like Dean Martin and, yes, Frank Sinatra. The Army gave him the time and the privacy to make that transformation happen. It was a 2-year vocal boot camp, self-designed and self-administered. When he returned to the RCA studios in Nashville in March 1960, he was a changed man with a changed voice, ready to record a new kind of music. But this raises some troubling questions. In his quest to become a more serious singer, did Elvis lose the very thing that made him special? Was the raw, untamed quality of his early voice a casualty of his ambition? Did the isolation of his life in Germany lead him to overthink his talent, to sand it down until it was smooth and perfect, but also less exciting? And we have to wonder, what if he had spent those 2 years in Germany singing nothing but raw gut bucket blues and rockabilly? Would the musical landscape of the 1960s have been completely different? Number 14, who was the woman before Priscilla? When people think of Elvis's love life in Germany, one name comes to mind: Priscilla Beaulieu. The story of their meeting is legendary. She was the innocent 14-year-old stepdaughter of an Air Force captain. He was the lonely king, far from home. It's a story that has been told and retold, a fairy tale romance. But it's not the whole story. Before Priscilla entered the picture in the fall of 1959, there was another woman. Her name was Elisabeth Stefaniak. Elisabeth was a young, blonde German woman who Elvis met shortly after arriving in Germany in 1958. As she was sharp, witty, and mature, Elvis hired her to be his secretary, handling his fan mail and correspondence. But their relationship quickly became much more than professional. For over a year, she was his constant companion. She lived and worked in his house at 14 Goestrasse. She was his girlfriend, his confidante, and his connection to the German world outside his isolated bubble. Their relationship was serious. Elvis even gave her a diamond ring. In photos from that period, they looked like any other young couple in love. She was with him at parties, on weekend trips, and during quiet nights at home. According to accounts from friends who were there, like Lamar Feek, Elvis was deeply attached to Elisabeth. She was a stabilizing force in his chaotic life. Unlike many of the people who surrounded him, she wasn't on his payroll in the traditional sense, even though he had hired her. Theirs was a genuine romance. Elvis even talked about the possibility of her coming back to the United States with him. Then, in the late summer of 1959, everything changed. A friend of Elvis's, an Air Force man named Curry Grant, knew the Beaulieu family. He arranged a meeting between Elvis and the 14-year-old Priscilla. Elvis was immediately smitten. The dynamic shifted almost overnight. Elisabeth, the mature 20-something woman, was suddenly on the outside looking in. The attention of the king had moved on to this young, doe-eyed American girl. What happened next is murky and sad. Elisabeth stayed on for a while, but the romance was over. She had to watch as Elvis pursued Priscilla. The situation was awkward and painful. Eventually, she left his circle. The story, as told by Elvis's camp, is that their relationship simply fizzled out. But others suggest that Colonel Parker may have played a role. Parker, ever the master manipulator, would have seen Priscilla as a much more suitable and controllable partner for Elvis's image. An American teenager was a much better story for the press back home than a German secretary. The book Elvis and the Colonel by Thomas, a Parker's former employee, Byron Raphael, suggests the Colonel actively managed Elvis's romantic life to ensure it fit the brand. Elisabeth eventually moved to the United States and married another man. She rarely spoke publicly about her time with Elvis. She was a footnote in a story that was now dominated by Priscilla, but for a significant period of his army years, she was the central woman in his life. She was there during his deepest grief over his mother's death. She was there for the late-night parties and the quiet moments. She saw a side of Elvis in Germany that few others did. Her story leaves us with a series of nagging questions. How serious was Elvis's relationship with Elisabeth Stefaniak? Was he truly in love with her? And was he planning a future with her before Priscilla came along? Did Colonel Parker or someone else in Elvis's inner circle orchestrate the end of their relationship to make way for the more marketable Priscilla? And the most poignant puzzle of all, if Elvis had stayed with the older, more worldly Elisabeth, a woman his own age, how might the rest of his life and his views on relationships have been different? Number 13, what was Colonel Parker's true endgame? While Elvis was in Germany, thousands of miles away from home, Colonel Tom Parker was not on vacation. He was in Hollywood working tirelessly. He was managing the Elvis Presley brand with an iron fist. Even with his star client out of the country, Parker's strategy during this period was a masterstroke of marketing and control. He called it Operation Elvis. The goal was to keep Elvis's name in the public eye for the entire 2 years he was gone, ensuring that his popularity didn't wane. Parker's plan had several parts. First, he stockpiled recordings. Before Elvis left, he had him record enough material for 5 single releases. Parker staggered these releases throughout 1958 and 1959. Hits like A Big Hunk O' Love and Now and Then There's a Fool, such as I Kept Elvis on the Charts and on the radio. This created the illusion that he had never left. It was a brilliant way to maintain commercial momentum. Second, Parker controlled the flow of information. He managed all media requests and fed the press a steady stream of carefully curated stories and photos of Elvis as a model soldier. He made sure the public saw the patriotic, clean-cut GI, not the lonely, grieving young man. But the most significant part of Parker's plan was what he was doing in Hollywood. He was negotiating a new future for Elvis. He met with studio heads, producers, and financiers. He secured a multi-picture deal with producer Hal Wallace at Paramount Pictures. As detailed in the book Colonel Tom Parker, The Curious Life of Elvis Presley's Eccentric Manager by James L. Dickerson, Parker's vision for the post-Army Elvis had nothing to do with rock and roll. It was all about movies, not serious, dramatic movies, but light, formulaic musical comedies. These films were relatively cheap to make, could be shot quickly, and most importantly generated profitable soundtrack albums. This was Parker's endgame. He wanted to turn Elvis from a controversial rock star into a reliable, family-friendly cash cow. The Army was the perfect tool for this transformation. It took the rebellious Elvis off the stage and washed him clean in the public's imagination. When he returned, he would be a veteran, a respected figure. He would be safe. Parker wasn't just maintaining Elvis's career, he was fundamentally altering it. He was steering the ship away from the dangerous waters of rock and roll and into the calm, profitable harbor of Hollywood. Elvis, isolated in Germany, had little say in any of this. He was connected to Parker by phone and mail, but he was not in the rooms where his future was being decided. He trusted the Colonel completely. He believed Parker was acting in his best interest. In reality, Parker was acting in his own best interest. He was creating a business model that was easy to manage and incredibly lucrative. The movies required little creative risk. They were a product, and Elvis was the star ingredient. The Army years were the crucial transition period that allowed Parker to execute this plan without any interference from Elvis himself. By the time Elvis came home, his new career path was already paved. He just had to walk it. This raises some deeply troubling questions about control and manipulation. Did Colonel Parker use the Army years as a deliberate opportunity to seize total control over Elvis's career and creative direction? Was Elvis aware of the extent to which his future was being planned for him, or was he a pawn in Parker's grand scheme? And the most critical puzzle, if Elvis had not been drafted, would he have had the strength and independence to resist Parker's push towards Hollywood, and could he have continued to evolve as a serious musical artist instead of becoming a movie star? Number 12. Where did the rock and roll go? In 1957, Elvis Presley was the undisputed king of rock and roll. His music was a dangerous, thrilling mix of blues, country, and gospel, delivered with a raw, sexual energy that terrified parents and captivated teenagers. He was a musical revolutionary. 2 years later, he came out of the Army and became a balladeer. The wild man who sang Jailhouse Rock was now singing lush, orchestrated pop songs like Are You Lonesome Tonight and It's Now or Never. The shift was so abrupt and so total that it remains one of the greatest puzzles of his career. Where did the rock and roll go? The easy answer is that it was a business decision orchestrated by Colonel Parker and RCA Records. They saw a more profitable future in adult contemporary music and movie soundtracks. This is undoubtedly true, as discussed before, but it's not the full picture. The change also came from within Elvis himself. His time in the Army changed his musical tastes and his ambitions as an artist. Living in Germany, he was exposed to a wider range of music than ever before. He listened to European pop, classical music, and the grand operatic style of singers like Mario Lanza. The Bad Nauheim tapes, those private home recordings, are the key evidence. On those tapes, he's not bashing out rockabilly tunes. He's carefully working through complex melodies, practicing his vocal control, and exploring the dramatic potential of his voice. He was falling in love with the power of the ballad. He was discovering that he could move an audience not just with a snarling lip and a wiggling hip, but with the sheer beauty and power of his voice. Furthermore, the army experience itself may have dampened his rebellious spirit. The military is about discipline, conformity, and following orders. It's the antithesis of the rock and roll ethos. 2 years of that life inevitably had an effect. He went in a boy who questioned authority. He came out a man who understood the chain of command. Some of that rock and roll spirit, which was rooted in a youthful defiance, may have simply been drilled out of him. When he returned to the studio in Nashville in 1960 for the sessions that would produce the Elvis Is Back album, the change was immediately apparent. The musicians, his old bandmates like Scotty Moore and DJ Fontana, were there, but the sound was different. Yes, there were a few rockers like Such a Night, but the heart of the album was in the ballads and the blues. The raw, clattering sound of his Sun Records days was gone, replaced by a polished, sophisticated studio sound expertly produced by Chet Atkins. Elvis was in complete command, his new, powerful baritone front and center. It was a stunning vocal performance, but it wasn't rock and roll. Music historian Grail Marcus, in his book Mystery Train, grapples with this transformation. He suggests that Elvis made a conscious choice to leave behind the apocalyptic energy of his early work for something more refined and ultimately less vital. He had the ability to sing anything, and he chose to sing pop. He traded his crown as the king of rock and roll for the title of the king, a more general, all-purpose entertainer. The Army years were the crucible where this decision was forged. It was a period of musical self-discovery that led him away from the very sound that had made him a legend. The unsolved questions are fundamental to his legacy. Was this musical shift a natural artistic evolution or a tragic wrong turn? Did Elvis abandon rock and roll, or did he feel that rock and roll in its original raw form had abandoned him? And if he had come out of the Army and recorded a blistering, no-holds-barred rock album, could he have single-handedly fought off the softer sounds of the early 60s and kept the rebellious spirit of the 50s alive? Number 11 were his Army friends, really his friends. Elvis Presley was a man who was always surrounded by people. He craved company. He hated being alone. This was true even in the Army. During basic training at Fort Hood, and especially during his time in Germany, he formed a new inner circle, a band of brothers made up of his fellow soldiers. Other men like Charlie Hodge, Rex Mansfield, and Joe Esposito became part of his life. They trained with him, lived with him, or spent all their free time at his house, and became his confidants. On the surface, it looked like genuine friendship, a group of young guys sticking together far from home. But the dynamic was complicated from the start. Elvis was not just another soldier. He was Elvis Presley. This created an immediate and inescapable power imbalance. He had money, fame, and a charisma that was almost hypnotic. The men around him were drawn into his orbit. He was generous to a fault. He would buy them cars, clothes, and pay for lavish nights out. He offered them a life of excitement and privilege that was a world away from the dull routine of a typical GI. In his memoir, Elvis, My Best Man, Joe Esposito describes the intoxicating pull of being in Elvis's world. Life was never boring. There was always something happening, a party, a trip, a new girl. But this also meant that their lives began to revolve around him. They became his support system, his bodyguards, his yes men. They were employees as much as they were friends. After the Army, many of them, like Esposito, Hodge, and Red West, who was a high school friend but also served in the Army and was with him in Germany, would go on his payroll as part of his entourage, the Memphis Mafia. The relationship was transactional. They provided him with companionship, loyalty, and a buffer against the outside world. In return, he provided them with a lifestyle. This arrangement, which was solidified in Germany, set the pattern for the rest of his life. He surrounded himself with a protective wall of familiar faces, people who depended on him for their livelihood. This made it incredibly difficult for anyone to tell him no or to challenge his increasingly self-destructive behavior in later years. Rex Mansfield, in his book Elvis in the Army, provides a more critical look at the dynamic. He details how he eventually chose to leave the inner circle because he felt it was unhealthy. He saw how Elvis's every whim was catered to, and how difficult it was to have a normal, balanced friendship with someone who held all the power. The friendships forged in the Army were real in the sense that there was genuine affection. But they were also deeply flawed, built on a foundation of dependency and celebrity worship. These weren't friendships between equals. They were relationships between a king and his court. And The court was established not at Graceland, but in a rented house in Bad Nauheim, Germany. This leaves us with some difficult questions about the nature of friendship and fame. Could anyone have ever had a truly normal friendship with Elvis Presley? Were the men he befriended in the army genuine companions? Or were they, from the very beginning, auditioning for a job in his post-army life? And the most important puzzle, did the dependent nature of these army friendships create the template for the isolation that would plague him for the rest of his life, cutting him off from anyone who could have told him the hard truths he needed to hear? Number 10. How did a 14-year-old girl enter his life? The story is one of pop culture's most enduring and strangest fairy tales. In the fall of 1959, in Bad Nauheim, Germany, 24-year-old Elvis Presley, the biggest star in the world, met 14-year-old Priscilla Beaulieu. She was the stepdaughter of a U.S. Air Force captain stationed nearby. A mutual acquaintance, a man named Curry Grant, brought her to a party at Elvis's house. Oh, Elvis was immediately captivated. She was young, beautiful, and by her own account in her book Elvis and Me, incredibly shy. He played the piano for her. He was charming. He was also a global icon, a full decade older than her. How did this happen? How did a 14-year-old girl, a freshman in high school, end up in a relationship with Elvis Presley? The circumstances are, by today's standards, deeply questionable. The initial meeting was arranged by an adult, Curry Grant. Priscilla's parents, Captain Paul Beaulieu and her mother Anne, were initially very hesitant. They were worried about the age difference and Elvis's reputation, but Elvis was persistent. He visited their home, he turned on his famous charm, he promised them that he would treat their daughter with respect, that his intentions were honorable. He told them he saw her as a little sister, someone he could talk to, a piece of home in a foreign land. Somehow, he convinced them. They agreed to let Priscilla see him, but under strict conditions. She had to be home by a certain time. Her schoolwork could not suffer. For the next several months, until Elvis left Germany in March 1960, they were inseparable. She would go to his house after school, they would listen to records, watch movies, and talk for hours. Elvis, still grieving for his mother, seemed to find a unique comfort in her presence. He felt he could mold her into his ideal woman. He told her how to dress, how to wear her hair, how to apply her makeup. She became his living doll. The relationship was, according to both of them, not sexual during this time. Elvis was adamant about waiting, but it was still an intense, deeply psychological relationship between a powerful adult man and a very young, impressionable girl. He was shaping her identity, he was controlling her world, the power dynamic was enormously skewed. She was a child and he was a king. Author Suzanne Finstad's book, Chilled Bride, The Untold Story of Priscilla Beaulieu Presley, dives deep into the complexities and controversies of this period, questioning the simple fairy tale narrative. The rebellious' decision to allow the relationship remains a source of debate and confusion. Were they simply starstruck? Did they genuinely believe Elvis's promises, or were they overwhelmed by a force of nature they couldn't possibly control? The fact that a global superstar was able to form a romantic relationship with a minor, with her parents' consent, is one of the most bizarre chapters in his life. It was a situation that could only have happened in the strange isolated bubble of his life in Germany, away from the scrutiny of the American press. The puzzles surrounding their meeting are profound. What did Elvis, a man who could have any woman in the world, see in a 14-year-old girl? Was he seeking innocence and purity in a world that had become complicated and dark? How did he manage to convince her parents that a relationship between a 24-year-old rock star and their 14-year-old daughter was acceptable? And the most unsettling question of all, was their relationship a genuine, if unconventional, love story, or was it a case of sophisticated grooming, a powerful man shaping a child to fit his own needs and desires? Number 9. What was Vernon Presley really doing in Germany? When Elvis was stationed in Germany, he was not alone. He brought a piece of his family with him. His father, Vernon Presley, and his paternal grandmother, Minnie May, moved to Germany to live with him in the rented house at 14 Goethestrasse. On the surface, this seemed like a natural arrangement. Elvis was famously close to his family. His mother had just died, and he was adrift in grief. Having his father and grandmother there was meant to provide a sense of stability and a connection to home. But Vernon's presence in Germany created its own set of problems and raises a number of questions. Vernon Presley was a complex figure. He had a history of financial mismanagement and had even served time in prison for check fraud when Elvis was a child. Elvis loved his father, but their relationship was often strained. Vernon was put in charge of managing Elvis's finances and household affairs in Germany, but he was ill-equipped for the task. The house on Gothastrasse was constantly filled with people, parties raged, money was spent freely. Vernon seemed more like a bystander than a figure of authority. He was a man in an impossible position, he was the father of the most famous man in the world, yet he was also, in a sense, his son's employee. He was living in a house paid for by his son, living a life funded by his son. This inverted the traditional father-son dynamic. Elvis was the provider, the patriarch. While Vernon was a dependent, this often led to tension. Accounts from those who were there, chronicled in books like Peter Guralnick's Careless Love, describe Vernon as being frequently worried and out of his depth. He fretted about the spending, the hangers-on, and the wild lifestyle, but he had little real power to control it. Furthermore, Vernon was also grieving the loss of his wife, Gladys, but his way of grieving was very different from Elvis's. While Elvis retreated into himself, Vernon began a relationship with a woman named Dee Stanley, the wife of an American sergeant. This relationship started while he was still in Germany. This caused even more tension with Elvis, who felt it was a betrayal of his mother's memory. The seeds of the future family conflicts that would plague the Presleys for years were sown in that house in Germany. Vernon's role was supposed to be that of a protector, a parental figure, who could guide his famous son through a difficult time. Instead, he often seemed like just another member of the entourage swept up in the chaos. He was there, but he wasn't really in charge. He couldn't protect Elvis from the pills, the isolation, or the pressures of his own fame. He was a father who had lost his authority, a man overshadowed by the colossal fame of his own child. This leads to some critical, unanswered questions. What was the true nature of the relationship between Elvis and Vernon during their time in Germany? Was Vernon a stabilizing influence, or did his presence and his inability to control the situation actually make things worse? How did Vernon's own personal issues, including his new relationship and his financial anxieties, affect his grieving son? And if Vernon had been a stronger, more authoritative father figure, could he have prevented the bad habits and dependencies that took root in Elvis's life during those 2 years? Number 8, who taught Elvis to fight? One of the most significant and lasting changes in Elvis's life during his army years had nothing to do with music. It was his discovery of karate. It wasn't just a hobby, it became a lifelong obsession, a core part of his identity, and a spiritual discipline that he pursued with a religious fervor. The images of Elvis in the 1970s, on stage in his white jumpsuits, performing karate kicks and chops, are iconic. That journey began in Germany, but the origin story is surprisingly murky. Who was the first person to truly introduce Elvis to the world of martial arts? The common story is that he was introduced to the art by a German Shotokan karate expert named Jürgen Seidel. Seidel was a local instructor, and Elvis began taking lessons from him. However, some accounts suggest his first exposure came even earlier. While on leave in Paris in 1959, he allegedly received some private instruction. The most significant figure in his early training, however, was a man he met through the army, a U.S. soldier and Chito-ryu karate instructor named Hank Slamansky. Slamansky was a tough, no-nonsense teacher. Elvis, along with some of his army buddies, began training under him. He was a demanding instructor who, crucially, did not give Elvis any special treatment because of his fame. He made him work, he made him sweat, he pushed him. This was exactly what Elvis needed. For him, karate was not about fighting, it was about discipline and control. At a time when his life felt chaotic and out of his own hands, the structured, ritualized world of martial arts offered him a sense of power and order. He fell in love with it. He practiced constantly. The living room of his house in Bad Nauheim was often turned into a dojo. He would spend hours practicing his forms, or kata, and sparring with his friends. He read every book he could find on the subject. He saw it as more than just a physical activity. He was drawn to the Eastern philosophy behind it, the concepts of ki energy, focus, and spiritual development. In a letter he wrote from Germany, he described it as a whole new spiritual world. This was documented by author Jerry Schilling, a close friend, in his book Me and a Guy Named Elvis. When he returned to the United States, his passion for karate only grew. He would eventually earn a black belt and study under some of the most famous martial artists in the world, like Ed Parker and Kang Rhee. It became a central part of his stage show and his personal life. He saw it as a way to protect himself, but also as a way to center himself. It was his meditation, his therapy, his religion, and it all started because of a chance encounter during his time as a soldier in Germany. But the puzzle of his beginnings in karate remains. Who was his first true sensei? Was it the German Seidel, the American soldier, Slamansky, or some unknown instructor in Paris? How did he manage to find such dedicated instructors in the relatively obscure world of European martial arts in the late 1950s? And the most profound question, what was he really looking for in karate? Was it self-defense, physical fitness, or was he searching for a spiritual discipline, a code to live by that he felt was missing from his own life? Was the dojo the only place where the king could feel like a humble student again? Number 7 was Gladys's death an unavoidable tragedy. On August 14th, 1958, just a few months after Elvis began his army service at Fort Hood, Texas, his beloved mother, Gladys Presley, died of a heart attack caused by acute hepatitis. She was only 46 years old. Her death was the single most devastating event of Elvis's life. He was completely shattered. He sobbed uncontrollably at her funeral, throwing himself over her casket, crying, "Oh God, everything I have is gone." He had been granted emergency leave to fly from Texas to Memphis to be with her in her final days, but the loss was absolute. The puzzle here is a tragic one. Was her death an unavoidable medical event, or was it exacerbated or even caused by the stress and heartbreak of her son being in the army? Gladys Presley was never comfortable with her son's fame. She was a simple countrywoman who was terrified by the chaos and adoration that surrounded Elvis. She worried constantly about his safety, but her greatest fear was losing him. She and Elvis shared an incredibly, almost unnaturally close bond. They had their own private language, They were in many ways the center of each other's universe. When Elvis was drafted, Gladys was distraught. The thought of him being so far away, potentially in harm's way, was more than she could bear. According to Elaine Dundee's deeply researched biography, Elvis and Gladys's health took a sharp decline after Elvis left for basic training. She lost her appetite. She began drinking more heavily. She was taking diet pills, which some have suggested were likely amphetamines, to try and lose weight. She was quite simply pining away. She was dying of a broken heart. Her official cause of death was liver failure, but the context is crucial. The emotional distress she was under undoubtedly weakened her body and made her more susceptible to illness. The separation from Elvis was a physical blow. She had spent her entire life protecting him, and now she couldn't. He was in the hands of the U.S. Army, a faceless institution, and she was helpless. This sense of powerlessness seems to have crushed her spirit. The tragedy is layered with what-ifs. Elvis had offered to serve in the special services, which would have allowed him to entertain the troops and likely live at home. But Colonel Parker, wanting to cultivate a regular GI image, advised against it. Elvis, wanting to do the right thing and make his country proud, agreed. Had he taken the special services option, he would have been at Graceland with his mother. He would have been there when her health began to fail. He could have gotten her better medical care sooner. He could have been there to comfort her. The guilt that Elvis must have felt over this is unimaginable. He had joined the army to do the right thing, to be a good son and a good citizen. And in doing so, he was separated from his mother at the very time she needed him most. Her death would haunt him for the rest of his life. It cast a long, dark shadow over his time in the army and everything that came after. He left for the army as a boy. After his mother's death, he was a man, but a broken one. The questions that remain are heartbreaking. How much did the stress of Elvis's induction into the army contribute directly to Gladys's physical decline and death? If he had chosen a different form of service that allowed him to stay home, would she have survived? And the most painful puzzle of all, did Elvis spend the rest of his life blaming himself and the army for the loss of the most important person in his world? Number 6. What secrets are hidden on the lost Frankfurt tapes? We know that Elvis recorded hours of informal music at his home in Bad Nauheim, Germany. These recordings, often called the Frankfurt Sessions or the Bad Nauheim tapes, are a fascinating glimpse into his musical mind during this transitional period. Several of these tapes have surfaced over the years, released on various bootlegs and official compilations. They show him experimenting with ballads, gospel, and pop, reshaping his voice and his style. But here's the puzzle, is that all of them. Rumors have persisted for decades that there are more tapes, hours of recordings that have never been heard by the public. These aren't just myths. People who were there, like his army buddy Charlie Hodge and his friend Lamar Feek, have spoken about the sheer volume of music that was recorded in that house. They didn't just record a few songs on a handful of occasions, they recorded constantly. It was how they passed the long, lonely nights, what might be on these lost tapes. The possibilities are tantalizing. There could be early acoustic versions of songs that he would later record professionally. There could be him working through his own original compositions, something he rarely did in the studio. He might have been writing songs about his mother, his loneliness, his experiences in the army. These tapes could hold the key to his emotional state, a raw, unfiltered look into his soul at a time of immense turmoil. There could also be more of what we've already heard, more gospel, more pop ballads, but there might also be the opposite. Like, is it possible that on some nights, feeling nostalgic for his old life, he bashed out some raw, pure rock and roll? Did he ever plug in an electric guitar and let loose with the kind of energy he was famous for? Finding a tape of Elvis in 1959 singing a blistering, unreleased rockabilly track would be like finding a new Dead Sea Scroll for music historians. It would completely change our understanding of his musical evolution during this period. So where are these tapes? That's the biggest mystery. Elvis was not meticulous about archiving his personal belongings. Tapes could have been given to friends. They could have been recorded over. They could have been lost in the shuffle when he moved back to the States. They could be sitting in an attic or a basement somewhere, their owner having no idea of their historical significance. They could also have been deliberately kept hidden. The existence of these lost tapes represents a huge blank spot in his story. The known tapes show one side of his musical development, the move towards becoming a balladeer. The lost tapes could show another side entirely. They could reveal a man torn between his past and his future, a man who hadn't completely given up on the fire of his youth. They are the missing diary entries from the most pivotal 2 years of his life. The questions they raise are thrilling for any fan or historian. How many hours of unreleased home recordings from Germany actually exist? What musical styles and what unreleased songs are on them? Could these tapes contain his most personal and revealing work, created in a private space, free from the commercial pressures of RCA and Colonel Parker? And will these lost artifacts ever surface? Or are the most intimate secrets of Elvis's army years lost to time forever? Number 5. Did the army medics prescribe his first pills? This is perhaps the darkest and most consequential puzzle of Elvis's army years. It's the origin story of a demon that would haunt him for the rest of his life and ultimately contribute to his death, his addiction to prescription drugs. By the 1970s, Elvis was consuming a staggering cocktail of uppers, downers, and painkillers. But where did it all begin? The trail leads back to Friedberg, Germany. According to multiple sources, including close friends like Rex Mansfield, who was with him at the time, Elvis was first introduced to amphetamines by a sergeant while on late-night maneuvers. The Army, especially during the Cold War era, had a pragmatic, if unofficial, attitude towards keeping soldiers alert during long, grueling exercises. Staying awake for 24 or 48 hours straight was a common requirement. To achieve this, stimulants were sometimes distributed. These weren't seen as drugs in the recreational sense. They were seen as tools, a way to get the job done. In his book, Elvis and the Army, Mansfield recounts how a non-commissioned officer gave him and Elvis some pills to help them stay awake and alert while on guard duty. Elvis, always eager to please and prove he was a good soldier, took them, and he was amazed by the effect. They gave him energy, they sharpened his focus, they allowed him to push through the fatigue. He had discovered a chemical solution to a physical problem. This discovery bled over into his personal life. He was living a double life, a soldier by day and a star by night. He would come back to his house in Bad Nauheim after a long day of army duties and stay up all night, hosting parties, practicing karate, and talking with his friends. To keep up with this grueling schedule, he began to rely on the amphetamines. They allowed him to burn the candle at both ends, but what goes up must come down. The amphetamines left him wired and unable to sleep, so he sought out another chemical solution, sleeping pills, barbiturates. This created the vicious cycle that would define his life. Uppers to get him going, downers to shut him down. This pattern, the one that would eventually kill him, was established not in Las Vegas or Hollywood, but in the U.S. Army. The Army's role in this is deeply troubling. While there's no official record of Army medics prescribing these drugs to Elvis for this purpose, the anecdotal evidence from those who were there is strong. It suggests a culture where the casual use of stimulants for performance enhancement was accepted, or at least tolerated. The Army didn't create an addict, but it introduced a vulnerable and curious young man to the tools of his own destruction. It showed him that there was a pill for every problem, a lesson he would take to a tragic extreme. This origin story leaves us with a series of chilling, unanswered questions. Who was the specific sergeant who first gave Elvis those pills? Was the distribution of amphetamines to soldiers on maneuvers a common, albeit unofficial, practice in the 3rd Armored Division at that time? Did any Army medical personnel ever officially prescribe these drugs to Elvis? And if so, what for? And the most haunting question of all, if Private Presley had never been ordered to go on those late-night maneuvers, would the world have ever lost Elvis Presley, the man, to the pills that consumed him? Number 4, why was he stationed in Friedberg, Germany? When a soldier gets their orders, their destination can seem random, a roll of the dice by a faceless bureaucracy. When Elvis Presley was assigned to the 3rd Armored Division, he was sent to Friedberg, a small German town about 16 miles north of Frankfurt. The official reason was simple. That's where the 1st Medium Tank Battalion, 32nd Armor was based, and they needed a soldier with his qualifications. He was trained as a tank crewman and later served as a jeep driver for a reconnaissance platoon. It was a standard assignment, but was it really that simple? When dealing with an asset as valuable as Elvis Presley, nothing is ever truly standard. The choice of Friedberg is a curious one, and it raises questions about whether there were other factors at play. Germany in the late 1950s was the front line of the Cold War. It was a strategically vital location for the U.S. Army. Placing America's most famous young man, there was a powerful symbolic gesture. It was a massive public relations victory. It showed the world, and especially the Soviet Union, that America was so committed to the defense of Europe that it was willing to send its biggest cultural icon to the front lines. Colonel Parker, a master of publicity, would have certainly understood the power of this imagery. While he had no direct control over the Army's posting decisions, it's not impossible to imagine that he or others working on his behalf might have communicated with the Pentagon about the PR benefits of a German assignment. The Army was also keenly aware of the propaganda value. They documented Elvis's time in Germany extensively, using him as the ultimate recruitment tool. As a posting in a less strategically important location, say in the Pacific, would not have had the same dramatic impact. There's also the question of safety. While Germany was the Cold War front line, a base like Friedberg was relatively secure. It was a garrison town, a place where the American military had a long-established presence. Well, it was not a combat zone. The Army had a duty to protect Private Presley, not just as a soldier, but as a national treasure. They couldn't risk sending him somewhere truly dangerous. Friedberg was the perfect compromise, strategically important for PR, but safe enough to ensure their star soldier wouldn't be in any real harm. Furthermore, its proximity to Frankfurt, a major international city with a large American population, was also convenient. This made logistics easier, both for the Army and for Elvis's personal life. It allowed for easier travel, communication, and access to amenities. It wasn't some remote, isolated outpost. It was a connected, relatively comfortable place to serve. So was the choice of Friedberg just a bureaucratic fluke? Or was it a carefully considered decision made at a high level that took into account public relations, propaganda, and the unique security needs of the world's most famous soldier? Was Elvis sent to Germany not just to be a soldier, but to be a symbol? We are left to wonder, did Elvis's assignment orders go through the same process as every other GI's, or was there a special meeting at the Pentagon where a map was unrolled and a finger pointed to Friedberg, Germany, as the perfect place to station the king of rock and roll? And did Elvis himself ever question why he, a boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, ended up driving a Jeep in the shadow of the Iron Curtain? Number 3, did Elvis secretly hate the Army? The public image of Elvis in the Army was one of a smiling, dedicated soldier. He said all the right things to the press. He talked about his duty to his country. He said he was proud to serve. He posed for photos, signed autographs for his fellow soldiers, and generally played the part of the model GI.com. This was the image that Colonel Parker carefully cultivated. It was an essential part of the plan to rebrand him as a wholesome, all-American hero. But what did he really feel? behind the public smiles and patriotic statements? Was there a different story? Was Elvis Presley, the rebellious icon, secretly miserable as a soldier? There is a significant amount of evidence to suggest that he was. First, consider the timing. He was drafted at the absolute peak of his fame. He was forced to walk away from his music, his movies, and his fortune, all to be a low-ranking private earning a pittance. It was a whiplash-inducing change in status and lifestyle. He went from being a king to being a number. It's hard to imagine anyone enjoying that. Then there was the death of his mother. This tragedy occurred just a few months into his service and forever colored his army experience with grief. The army became intertwined with the greatest loss of his life. How could he not, on some level, resent the institution that had separated him from his mother in her final months? Every day he put on that uniform, he was likely reminded of that terrible time. Like his friends, who were with him in Germany, have spoken about his moods. While he had good days, he also had periods of deep depression and loneliness. He was in a foreign country, surrounded by a language and culture he didn't understand. He missed home, he missed his music. The late-night parties and constant activity at his house in Bad Nauheim can be seen as a desperate attempt to stave off the boredom and sadness of his situation. He was trying to create a mini Graceland, a bubble of familiarity in an alien environment. In the biography Last Train to Memphis, Peter Guralnick paints a picture of a young man trying to make the best of a bad situation, but who was often just going through the motions. He did his job as a soldier competently, but his heart wasn't in it. His real life began after he left the base each day. The army was the thing he had to endure. It was a prison sentence he had to serve. The strongest evidence, however, might be his actions after he was discharged. He almost never spoke about his army years. He didn't romanticize his service or join veterans organizations. It was a chapter of his life that he seemed to want to close and forget. While he remained publicly patriotic, his personal connection to his time as a soldier seemed to be one he preferred not to revisit. He had done his duty, and that was that. It wasn't a source of pride or fond memory. It was a 2-year interruption that he had survived. This creates a puzzling contrast between the public and private Elvis. Was the smiling soldier just a role he was playing, perhaps his most difficult movie role ever? Did he secretly harbor a deep resentment for the army for taking him away from his career and, more tragically, his mother? And is it possible that the discipline and conformity of military life didn't build his character, but instead broke his rebellious spirit, making him more willing to accept the safe, uninspired career path Colonel Parker had planned for him? Number 2, could his mother's life have been saved? The death of Gladys Presley is the central tragedy of Elvis's life. The story we know is that she died of liver failure while he was in the army. But digging deeper into the circumstances reveals a puzzle that is both medical and emotional, and it centers on one heartbreaking question: could she have been saved? Gladys's health problems did not start when Elvis went into the army. She had been unwell for some time. She was overweight and her diet was poor. She was also, by many accounts, a heavy drinker. This was a hidden aspect of her life, something the family did not speak of publicly. In the context of the 1950s, especially in the conservative South, alcoholism, particularly in women, was a source of deep shame. But furthermore, she was taking various prescription pills, including diet pills, which were likely a form of amphetamine. This combination of a poor diet, alcohol, and pills was a ticking time bomb for her liver. When her health took a sharp turn for the worse in August 1958, she was admitted to Methodist Hospital in Memphis. The diagnosis was acute hepatitis. But what was the cause? Hepatitis can be caused by a virus, but it can also be caused by toxins like alcohol and drugs. Given her history, it is highly likely that she was suffering from alcoholic or toxic hepatitis. This is a serious condition, but it is not necessarily a death sentence, especially for a 46-year-old woman if it is caught and treated properly. This is where the puzzle deepens. Was she given the best possible medical care? The Presley family had, by this time, immense wealth. They could have afforded any doctor, any treatment, anywhere in the world. But they were also a family from a poor, rural background. They had a deep-seated distrust of doctors and formal medicine. It's possible that they didn't seek top-tier medical help until it was too late. They may have relied on their local family doctor for too long, not realizing the severity of the situation. Then there is the psychological component. As detailed in Elaine Dundee's Elvis and Gladys, her emotional state was at an all-time low. She was profoundly depressed over Elvis's absence. The will to live is a powerful, if unquantifiable, factor in medical outcomes. Did Gladys, heartbroken and alone, simply give up? Did her emotional despair hasten her physical decline? It's a question that medicine cannot fully answer. The most tragic part of the puzzle is Elvis's role. He was hundreds of miles away in Texas. He was reliant on information being relayed to him by his father. It's possible that the severity of her condition was downplayed to him at first, to keep him from worrying. By the time he was granted emergency leave and flew home, her liver had failed. He arrived at her bedside just in time to see her before she slipped into a coma. She died the next day. Had he been there a week earlier, a month earlier, would he have been able to use his influence and resources to get her to better specialists? Would his presence alone have given her the strength and the will to fight? We are left with a series of devastating, unanswerable questions. What was the exact medical cause of Gladys's hepatitis, and was it treatable with the medicine available in 1958? Did the Presley family's distrust of the medical establishment prevent them from seeking elite care until it was too late? And the question that surely haunted Elvis for the rest of his days, if he had been home, could he have saved her? Number one was the draft to government conspiracy. This is the ultimate puzzle of Elvis's army years, a question that has been debated by fans and biographers for decades. Why was Elvis Presley drafted? The simple answer is that it was the law. The United States had a peacetime draft in the 1950s, and Elvis's number came up. He was a healthy 23-year-old male citizen, and he was called to serve, just like millions of other young men. It was a random democratic process, but the circumstances surrounding his induction are so unique that they invite suspicion. Was it really just the luck of the draw, or was the drafting of Elvis Presley a deliberate, calculated act, a conspiracy between the U.S. government and conservative cultural forces to neutralize the most dangerous and influential young man in America? Consider the climate of the mid-1950s. Rock and roll was seen by many in the establishment as a genuine threat to the moral fabric of the nation. You know, it was loud, it was sexual, and it was breaking down racial barriers. You know, Elvis was the lightning rod for all this anxiety. Preachers condemned him from the pulpit. Parent groups protested his concerts. Local authorities tried to censor his performances. He was seen as a corrupting influence on the youth of America. What better way to tame this wild rebel than to hand him over to the most powerful institution of conformity in the country, the U.S. Army? The theory goes like this: powerful figures in Washington, perhaps in the FBI or in Congress, saw Elvis as a problem. They couldn't arrest him, so they used the draft. You know, it was a legal and publicly acceptable way to remove him from the cultural landscape for 2 years. They hoped that the discipline and regimentation of military life would clean him up, cut his hair, and turn him into a respectable, patriotic citizen. It was, in effect, a form of national service as social engineering. There is no smoking gun document to prove this theory. There are no declassified memos from J. Edgar Hoover ordering the Selective Service to draft Elvis. But the circumstantial evidence is compelling. The timing was perfect. Just as his fame was reaching its zenith, he was taken out of the picture. And the result was exactly what the establishment would have wanted. The Elvis who came out of the army was a tamer, safer version of the original. The rebellion was gone. He had been successfully neutered. Even Colonel Parker's role is ambiguous. Publicly, he fought for deferments so Elvis could finish filming King Creole. But some have speculated that Parker secretly welcomed the draft. He saw it as a brilliant PR opportunity, a way to rebrand his client and set him up for a long-term, more lucrative career as a family entertainer. Did he work behind the scenes, not to prevent the draft, but to ensure it happened in a way that was most beneficial to their image? The book Down at the End of Lonely Street, The Life and Death of Elvis Presley by Peter Harry Brown and Pat H. Broisky explores these darker possibilities, suggesting a web of powerful interests aligning to get Elvis into uniform. Was it a conspiracy, or was it just a confluence of events that happened to serve the interests of the establishment perfectly? It remains the foundational mystery of this period. We are left with the most profound questions of all. Was Elvis Presley's draft notice a random slip of paper, or was it a targeted weapon in a culture war? Was he a citizen doing his duty, or a political pawn in a much larger game? And ultimately, did the U.S. government, in an attempt to tame a cultural rebel, inadvertently set him on the path that would lead to his own self-destruction? The answer is locked away, somewhere in the unwritten history of those 2 fateful years.